Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Museum After Hours. I'm your host for this evening, Trey Johnson, and I can't wait for this incredible presentation we have in store for you. If this is your first time joining us, Museum After Hours is our monthly lecture series that covers a variety of topics in Kansas history. The presentation our guest speaker provides will be followed by a question and answer period that will allow you to communicate directly with our guest. So be sure to utilize the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens to pose those questions. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Caryn Mirriam-Goldberg, Kansas's poet laureate from 2009 to 2013 and author of 24 books, including Needle in the Bone, the focus of tonight's program. Dr. Mirriam-Goldberg is the founder of Transformative Language Arts, facilitates writing workshops, and offers life-giving collaborations like YourRightLivelihood.com, BraveVoice.com, and theartoffacilitation.net. Through her Patreon page, patrons can access weekly care packages for a creative life. I recommend that everyone go and take a look at her website along with her blog, Everyday Magic, at KarynMirriam-Goldberg.com. The program Dr. Mirriam-Goldberg has lined up for this evening is a subject we have never featured in Museum After Hours. Needle in the Bone, how a Holocaust survivor and Polish resistance fighter beat the odds and found each other, details the gripping stories of Lou Frydman and Jarek Piekalkewicz, who defied outrageous odds, lost almost everyone and everything in the war, and still summoned the courage to create a new life. Through extensive interviews and research, Dr. Mirriam-Goldberg will detail the nature of good and evil, the meaning of the Holocaust itself, and how individuals persevere in the face of unbearable pain and loss. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Caryn Mirriam-Goldberg.
Thank you so much for being here on this warm summer night, a summer that goes on for a long time this year. And thank you tremendously to Trey and Lois and everybody else at the Kansas Historical Museum and for your wonderful programs, and Kansas Historical Society for your wonderful programs and life-giving perspective from history and into the future. I'm going to share a PowerPoint that I'm going to talk through, and then we'll have some time for questions. And of course, you can put questions in chat, and you can also, I believe there's a Q&A where you can put questions also. So let's see, I'm going to begin, and I will see you back here in about 45 minutes. Hold on a moment, a little bit of the hiding things that we have to hide so that it won't be in the way. Okay, there we go. So this presentation is based on my book, Needle in the Bone, How a Holocaust Survivor and Polish Resistance Fighter Beat the Odds and Found Each Other. And this was a book I wrote after knowing Lou, who is in the center bottom, and he's also on the right, and Yarick, for many, many years. And hearing their stories, Lou had survived 6 concentration camps and 3 death marches. Yarick had survived being in the Polish underground, and one of his uncles was basically the leader of the underground army. Another one was the treasurer of the underground government. And they met in Lawrence, Kansas and became best friends. For years, I would say to them, why don't you write a book about your story? I can help you, you know, and about your friendship. And then one day, while eating blintzes with Lou and his wife, Jane, and Yarick and his wife, Moira, it just came out of my mouth. I'll write the book if you want me to. And before I could say no or stop myself, there I was. And I embarked upon this long journey. It was about 3 or 4 years of oral histories with them and a lot of research. But before I get into their stories, which by looking through, we can see more clearly how the Holocaust and Polish resistance affected so many people, I want to start with some background about why all of this happened, with the caveat that in a 45-minute presentation, I can give you more of an outline than an in-depth exploration. While most people know that approximately 6 million Jews were killed, the percentages show a much starker story. In the end, it's estimated that over two-thirds of Europe's Jewish population was killed. Poland's Jewish population of 3.3 million before 1939 was reduced by 85%, with 2.8 million Jews killed. Over 6 million Poles, over 21%, died, and that was between 1939 and 45. And if you look at other countries, over 71% of Jews living in the Soviet Union were killed. Half of Romania's and Hungary's Jewish populations were wiped out. And Lithuania and Latvia lost 90% or more of their Jewish population. At the same time, at least 340,000 Poles were soldiers in the underground, and up to 500,000 participated in the underground government or army one way or another. And approximately 3 million Poles, but the number may be much higher because it's not a number we can actually completely identify, helped hide Jews during the war, with very few denouncing them to the Nazis. So to understand what seeded the Holocaust and why over half the Jews in Europe were in Poland in the first place, here's a little bit of history on that. In 1290, Jews were expelled from England. About 100 years later, Jews were expelled from France. In the late 1390s, Spanish Jews faced conversion or death. By the 16th century, Jews were banned from the entire Habsburg monarchy, which encompassed Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and Lower Silesia. Poland and Turkey welcomed Jews because of greater religious tolerance and the need for skills that Jews brought. By the late 18th century, Poland was partitioned into Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And in the early 20th century, Poland reemerged as an independent country after the Russian Revolution. What power Jews had came from being prohibited from owning or working land, and from the Catholic Church seeing money handling as dirty. So Jews went into finance because somebody had to, and from there, trade and other enterprises. And this coincided with our world moving from an agricultural economy to a market economy. This also pushed more Jews into urban areas where business, industry, and finance were. By the early 1900s, Jewish life thrived. There was a Yiddish theater troops traveling all through cities like Łódź, Krakow, and Warsaw. In Lithuania and Vilna, it was kind of called the New Renaissance or Little Jerusalem. And there was definitely a kind of Yiddish Renaissance. Jews in Poland before the war, because we're focusing especially on that. And you can see here, if you look, about 3 million in Poland, and it may be hard to see, but 2.5 million in Russia. And you can also see pictures of Jewish life here, and how some Jews definitely dressed differently than mainstream non-Jews and might have stood out a lot more, and some kind of blended in more. And the Jewish life was so vast and extensive in Europe at this time that there was a big range of what it meant to be Jewish. To understand how Hitler rose to power, we also need to pause here and look at some of those facts. And I'm just going to give you a quick summary. Of course, this is a huge, huge topic unto itself. There was enormous economic desperation after World War I, and the the victors of World War I making Germany pay may have been a big mistake in the long run, because it seeded the ground for somebody like Hitler to emerge. He attempted to overthrow the government in 1923, and that landed him in jail. And that's where he wrote his book that translates into My Struggle. The stock market crash boosted the Nazi Party, while the Social Democrats, Communists, Nationalists, and Catholic Center united against the Nazis. And I should add, Poland had a parliamentary form of government then. And Hitler made a deal with President Hindenburg, who was somewhat senile. And I said Poland, I meant Germany. Somewhat senile, to take over the government and become chancellor in early 1933. The Nazi Party mushroomed due to the economic crisis, latent anti-Semitism, and suppressing all opponents. Hitler forced an emergency decree suspending civil rights, and then communists, socialists, liberals, and trade unionists who opposed him were jailed, tortured, or killed. The free press was also banned. The Nazis then cut a deal with other parties to acquire a 2/3 majority vote, which made Hitler the legal dictator. And after Hindenburg died, Hitler took what was left of his position and consolidated it. And then all other political parties were banned in 1934. Hitler established the secret police, the Gestapo under Göring, which eliminated opposition. The SS, a black-shirted security service, started in the 1920s, first as a special guard for Hitler, and it had its own courts, press, military branch, and, as we know, reputation. During this time from Germany, there were hundreds of laws that came down that diminished Jewish rights inch by inch. Some by themselves may not seem that severe, but many Holocaust historians talk about incrementalism, how incrementally the Holocaust was able to take place. In 1933, Jews were forbidden to be admitted to the bar, and Jewish citizenship, or naturalized Jews, was revoked. A few years later, the army expelled Jewish officers. In 1936, Jews could no longer serve as tax consultants. Jewish teachers were banned from public schools. In 1937, Jewish children were banned from Berlin public schools and soon schools all over Germany. In 1938, Jews could no longer be auctioneers. They were banned from health spas. Jews were required to adopt the name Sarah for women and Israel for men, which further depersonalized them. Regulations were passed to ease the transfer of property from Jews to non-Jews. All German passports held by Jews now had the letter J on them. All Jewish businesses were forced to close, and Jews were even forbidden from keeping carrier pigeons, which would have allowed them to communicate more what was happening. In 1939, they were forced to surrender precious metals and stones and forbidden from buying lottery tickets. These are just a few of hundreds of rules. There's even rules where Jews couldn't buy milk or pick flowers. And then, as we all know, on September 1st, Germany invaded Poland and World War II began. And I have some headlines here, and you can see Germany, the Axis powers, were teamed in the beginning part of the war with the Soviet Union, and they came into Poland from all sides. And there's a whole story of how the Germans set up the invasion. There was a radio station in Silesia. The Germans hired prisoners to wear Polish army uniforms and come in and shoot guns and make a lot of noise, and then use that as a pretext for the invasion. The prisoners were told if they did that, they would be freed, but instead they were all killed. And then Germany and the Soviet Union were ready to just invade from all sides. Here's some images of the invasion in September of 1939. Some countries, as we know, fell to Germany very fast. Poland was able to keep fighting in some places as long as 5 or more weeks, but much of the country fell within a month. And here we have Warsaw fell by September 28th. Over 200,000 Poles were killed and wounded, 420,000 taken prisoner. Close to 100,000 members of the Home Army were killed. And Home Army or the Resistance Army or the Underground Army, we're talking about the same thing. Over 100,000 were wounded, including 32,000 Jewish soldiers. The Germans lost 45,000 men. During the period that followed, 531 towns and villages were burned, with the largest cities in Poland, Łódź and Warsaw, suffering the heaviest losses. And over 16,000 people were executed, mostly Polish Christians. Jews were then forced into ghettos, and I know you probably can't read this carefully, but if you can see all the dots everywhere, this gives you a sense that there were hundreds, there were thousands actually, of ghettos. Jews were forced into small areas in cities. There's more than 1,000 ghettos here. And Goebbels called the ghettos boxes of death. The expectation was that poverty, hunger, disease, and isolation would kill most of the inhabitants, but that is not what happened. And here's some images from ghettos in Poland. And when I first started doing this research and I would talk to Lou, I didn't have any idea how many ghettos there really were. I thought maybe a few dozen, but there were hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands actually. And then from there, Jews were forced into transits using that horrible word liquidation and taken to death camps or concentration camps. Death camps tend to be camps where just about everyone was killed except the people not killed because they were leading people in and out of the gas chambers. And concentration camps, you might have a little bit of a longer life. And when I was researching all of this with Lou over 10 years ago, we found there were about 1,300 camps, but actually you can see here there were over 47,000, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong statistic. There were thousands actually of camps and killing fields and other places where Jews were killed, and over 47,000 Germans were employed in the death camp industry. And this brings us to Lou's story. So Lou was born in Łódź. He was the youngest son of Chaim, and Chaim is in the upper left-hand side. And Riva, it's R-Y-W-A, but we could say Riva, she's in the lower right-hand side. And Lou and his older brother Abe would argue about whether that baby was Abe or Lou. See Chaim and Lou at the birth. You can also see his aunt and uncle and the apartment that his parents owned. And they had a huge apartment. It was actually divided into 3 apartments years later, and each one is very large. And they collected funds from tenants, and they had some homeless people who lived in the basement, and they just kind of worked with them. Here are some of Lou's extended family. He would tell me it was a crazy family. There were people who were extremely traditional, extremely orthodox, and not mixing at all with non-Jews, such as in the lower left-hand side, people in the long coats. And then you have people in bathing suits at the beach, having picnics, going on vacations. And every single person that you are looking at in this montage was killed in the Holocaust. And I share that with you to show how exceptional it was to survive. You and Lou and Yarick would often say to me, we're mathematical errors. We were not expected to survive. Here are more of Lou's extended family toward the end of the 1930s, all at some kind of party with amazing hats. And everybody you're looking at in this photo was killed in the Holocaust within short order. Lou told me that one thing he had to do to make sense of what he had been through was to put together his wartime itinerary. And so he did, and this is a condensed version of what he put together. So of course, the Germans invaded Poland, and that's actually a typo, it should be September 30th. The Frydman family stayed in Łódź, where they lived. They even had a Nazi soldier who moved in with them. He showed up with a requisition for a room, and they gave him a bedroom, and he was very polite, and eventually he left. They found that where they lived was becoming more and more an enclosed ghetto, and they had a sense that that ghetto would be liquidated, meaning everyone would be forced to get on trains to go to death camps or concentration camps. So they escaped to another ghetto, which they thought might last a little longer, in Piekarków. And they lived there with another family in a small house. During that time, Lou was sent to live on a farm near Łódź with a Catholic family, and he was taught Catholic prayers and even how to cross himself, and so that perhaps he could pass if he had to pretend not to be Jewish. He then returned to his family. And after a while, Piekarków, that ghetto was going to be liquidated. So Riva and the two boys, Abe and Lou, moved to Warsaw to hide in an apartment. Chaim, who looked more Jewish and wouldn't necessarily pass in the world as much, slipped into the Warsaw ghetto. And how people did this is that there was outrageous corruption every which way, and all you had to do was bribe a guard. And they counted the people who went out each day to work in factories for the Germans and the people who came back, and the numbers just had to be even. So with bribing a guard, you could go out and escape, and somebody else who wanted to get in could take your place and come back in. Eventually, Riva, Abe, and Lou heard the dreaded knock on the door. And this is the first time that Lou's life could have ended, but didn't. They were discovered by the Polish police, who were forced to work for the Germans. And Lou's very smart mother said to them, "You can take us, but then you'll never know what you might have had." Negotiations ensued, and she paid them some money and gave them some jewels. Lou's dad had been a jeweler for a while. They shook hands, and then they had 15 minutes to escape into the Warsaw ghetto. Once there in February, they arrived at a very high time. We tend to think of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising as the uprising, but actually in January of 1943, the underground organizations in the Warsaw Ghetto, all these Jewish military and non-military organizations, banded together, and when the Germans came in to liquidate the ghetto, they drove them out and inflicted a lot of damage. And so everybody was feeling pretty good about having survived that by February, but they also knew the Germans would be back. And Lou's family, when the Germans came back on April 19th, went into hiding in an underground bunker. There were over 600 underground bunkers or cellars or other places where people hid. And Lou said they had electricity and they had food. He said they even had poetry readings to try to hold them up. And by April 28th, they heard a voice calling them and saying, if you want to fight us, we respect that, but otherwise, come surrender. And they knew they had to surrender. They knew it was the weight of the German army up there. And 1/3 of the people in that underground bunker, there were over 400 of them in that one, took cyanide and killed themselves. They said goodbye to their friends and family. And that might seem incredibly drastic, but dying through the gas chambers was a horrendous, painful way to die. And the chance, once people were taken to death camps, that they would die was astronomically high. I said to Lou, did your parents believe you and Abe might survive, and that's why they didn't give you poison? And he said, no, they just didn't have any. But they did survive. The ghetto was finally liquidated. Once they got above ground, Lou's father Haim was taken with all the other men around the corner, and all of those men were shot on the spot. And then Lou and his mother and his brother and also his aunt and cousins were taken to a camp called Lipova 7. It was a subcamp of Majdanek. The camps had subcamps and the subcamps had subcamps. Sometimes you'd have dozens and dozens of camps under one name. And they waited there for 2 days, and then there was an announcement calling for 3,000 expert metal workers. Lou was 13 or so, his brother was 14. They were not expert metal workers, but his mom nudged them to raise their hands. Keep in mind, there were no men left. Most of them had been shot. And he and his brother were chosen, but his cousins who were wearing shorts, the type that ended the knees, were not chosen. Lou and his brother were wearing long pants, and that saved them at that moment. His mother was later killed at Majdanek. Lou and Abe then went to Budzin, which was a subcamp kind of in its own Wild West in Majdanek, and it was ruled by a very cruel general, Feitz, who would often blow a whistle in the middle of the night, and everybody would have to run out and stand in the courtyard and follow him with their eyes and not move their bodies for hours. And if anybody did it wrong, he would shoot them. He was up high looking down at all the prisoners. And one night when the whistle blew, 13-year-old Lou jumps down and he lands on something very sharp in his heel. If he pulls it out, he will be killed. If he goes to the infirmary, well, he'll be killed on the way there. So he had to just endure the pain. And it wasn't until the early 1950s, while walking along a gravel road in New Jersey, when a speeding car sped a pebble out that hit his ankle and he had his foot x-rayed, that he found out he had a needle in his heel bone and the body had formed a protective shield around it. When he told me that story, I said, that is the name of the book we're writing, because the body, the heart forms a protective shield around what was meant to kill you, what is impossible to carry, and you go on. Eventually, Lou and Abe went to the Rotterdam concentration camp, and then they were forced on a death march to Moscow. And there they were locked in a factory for a week. It was very hot. Lou said both he and his brother could not recall anything about that factory. He said, we just conked out. And even though Lou went into psychology and social work, he never wanted to try to find out what happened. He knew that there wasn't much food, there was no sanitation, it was very hot, people were dying around them. And he said that was the worst week of the Holocaust for him, as far as he can tell. They were then shipped to Auschwitz for the sorting of prisoners. And here's another place where he might have been killed. He was asked by Well, first, an enlisted soldier told him, "Little boy, why don't you get out of line this and go with the children?" And he knew the children were going to the gas chambers. He refused to move. He believes it was Mendel himself who examined Lou later, but Lou's not positive. And Lou knew what to say. "What type of work do you like to do?" "Hard work." "What did your father do?" "He was a laborer." "How old are you?" 18. And he said Mendel or whoever it was looked at him and smiled and just let him stay. And the enlisted man came over and tried to persuade Lou to go with the children. And Lou said, "You're an enlisted man. He's an officer." He could have been killed right then, but the whistle blew and he was put on a train for Weihegen, which is in Germany. And he went to several work camps there, actually 3 of them. And then eventually, he and his brother were forced on a death march from Kokendorf to Hessenthal. They were starving, they were sick, and Lou collapsed somewhere between March 31st and April 4th. If you collapsed on a death march, usually what happened was you were put in a wagon, and when the wagon was full, you were taken behind some trees and shot. And he and his brother said goodbye to each other. They agreed their parents would want at least one of them to survive, so Abe should go on. But instead of being shot, Lou and the other people in the wagon were each given an apple, which revitalized him. At that point in the war, if the Germans didn't have prisoners to march around, they would be sent to the Eastern Front to fight the Soviet Union, and that saved Lou's life. He ended up on yet another death march, and by the end of the war, he was in a subcamp of Dachau, and he would have been locked in a train car with others to probably die, but he and someone else were picked out and told to clean the camps because the Americans were coming. They didn't want it to look bad, which to me is an outrageous irony. So here are some images, Lou shortly after the war. You can see some of the subcamps of Majdanek. You can also see the memorial at Treblinka, which was a death camp. After the war, Lou found his brother. Well, first he passed out at Dachau, and he woke up in a hospital where he was being nursed back to health. And he just kept asking people about his brother and traveling around. He found him. And thanks to a genius and very compassionate woman named Rachel Green, who started a program at a Glosterhausen, he and his brother and other kids were sent there to just be kids again. They had a year of riding bicycles, watching movies, going to school, and figuring out what's next. You can see his displaced persons card. In the picture on the bottom, on the left-hand side, Lou is standing up and his brother is sitting in front of him. And then in the picture on top to the right, Lou is at the left-hand side right next to his brother. He and his brother looked like they might go to Israel, then to England. Eventually they were sent to America, where they were put in the foster care system, which really upset Luke and Abe because they felt like they could survive on their own. They went to New York. They were both really bright kids, and Rachel Green saw that New York had free college if you did relatively well, and she wanted them to go to college. Lou had a bad foster care experience. His brother had a better one. But here he is at his high school and college graduation. He then began college at Hunter College, where he met Jane Frydman, or she became Jane Frydman. She was born in Vienna and grew up in Budapest, and her very wise mother, sensing what was happening, managed to smuggle the family out of Europe, even though they had to go through Berlin in the middle of the war. And here Lou and Jane are at their wedding. Their engagement party, and an ice skating date. Lou went on and got a master's and then eventually a PhD. He studied psychology and social work, and he lived in Connecticut with his wife, and they had 3 sons, Danny, John, and Rick. And after a while, they decided that where they were in Connecticut was too commercial, too materialistic. So they traveled the country in their wood-paneled station wagon to see where they wanted to live. They decided they wanted to live in the Northwest. So of course they ended up in Kansas. They thought they'd stay a year at KU. A new social work department was being started, but it turned out to be a lifetime. And Lou also volunteered helping with mental health rights for patients, and he gave a lot of Holocaust presentations. Here's Lou and Jane over the years. And here's Lou and his grandkids and family. In the upper left-hand photo, the white-haired people are Jane's parents who escaped from Budapest. When Jane's mother also managed to get her parents here, but here they are. Jane's parents are here now. And there's also in the upper right-hand photo is Rick and his then wife Amy and his brothers and family. And down below is Rick and his daughters and Jane and Lou. So you get more of a sense of them. Lou and Jane had 5 children within 2 miles, 5 grandchildren, and their life was devoted to their grandchildren. They were pretty close in age, and you can see their many times with their beloved grandkids. And Lou and Abe were able to go back to Poland, and they set up memorials in Łódź and other places in honor of their parents. Abe is the not Lou in these pictures that you can see. At one point, Lou got a Fulbright, which is how he got to know Yarick well. And when he was researching in Poland, the first time he had returned since the war, he found out his first name was actually Isidore, not Lou, but he kept Lou. And here he is over the years. And quintessential Lou pictures, the bottom right-hand one, he's doing his grandpa face. So that gives you a sense of Lou. So before we go into Yarick, I wanted to share the Polish underground state was pretty vast. And I know you probably can't read this whole chart, but this gives you a sense of the Polish underground government in London. And then there was a military and civilian branch. And like we said, over 500,000 people were working for this underground government to try to push the Germans out. The Polish resistance or the Home Army over the years. And here's the Home Army on the offensive and the defensive. And I'll share Yarick's story in just a moment, which will contextualize this even more. The Warsaw Uprising happened a year after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And this is when the Polish underground or Home Army had attacked the Germans with the understanding that the Russians or Soviets who were on the other side of the Vistula River were going to come to their aid and they would end the war. But the Soviets just cooled their heels and didn't come to their aid because, of course, the Soviets had something else in mind. And we know that from the communist bloc that happened years later. And so it was a 60-day or so war. The front lines were between buildings. You could be in one room and hear somebody on the other side of another room who was your enemy. And Yarick fought in this, And then with many other POWs, he went on the Saigon POW March. You can see the route here. And then he went to this POW camp. And the film, The Great Escape, that classic film, is about this. Okay, so Yarick's story, he came from old money. He came from the gentry. And his maternal great-grandmother is here, and his great-grandfather. And in this photo to the lower right, you can see the little baby being held as his mother, and she has the same face you'll see on him in a moment. His parents fell in love. His dad was about 20 years older. And in 1939, shortly before the war, his father died of cancer. So here are his parents earlier on in their marriage and later on. Yarick was one of 3 children. If you look at the lower right-hand photo, you can see him on his mother's lap, that same face you saw a few slides back on his mother. He had a brother named Lek and a sister named Barbara, and they had nannies and language lessons and all kinds of privilege growing up. His wartime itinerary is that, of course, when Poland was invaded, they were put on alert. His family moved from Warsaw to an uncle's estate in Biała Podlaska to be safe. They returned to Warsaw. Then he was a troublemaker. He was a kid who was always getting into mischief. So he was sent to live with his grandmother and aunt in Biała Podlaska, where he and a cousin organized their own resistance group, their own army. His family got wind of it and interviewed him. They were afraid he had been co-opted by the Germans or the Soviets. They were very relieved to find out, no, he had just started his own army, and he had 30 or 40 people, and he was the leader of it, and he was only 16. And they integrated those people into the underground, and he found out, surprise, his whole family was very involved in the underground army. He rejoined his family in Warsaw. He became a corporal in a newly formed battalion. Eventually, he became the head of that battalion. And for 2 months, he participated in the Warsaw Uprising. Eventually, the Home Army surrendered and he became a POW. And then the Death March and POW camp experience. At one point, he escaped, got very feverishly sick in the woods, was stealing food from rabbits. But eventually, through all kinds of surprising things, he survived close calls. And eventually that all the POWs were forced to march west as the war efforts were turning toward the Allies. And they reached Western Germany and then were told to turn around and go back. Yarick said to me, been there, seen that, not doing it again. He escaped with a friend. He was liberated by the US Army. And he said there was a 3-day party where people drank constantly and then collapsed. And then the war in Europe ended. He then joined a British battalion. He could not go back to Poland and to his people there because his name, Piekalkewicz, was the name of Jan Piekalkewicz, who was basically the head of the underground until he was captured, tortured, and killed. And the Soviets now had control over much of Poland, and people like him were seen as troublemakers, and they were being jailed and killed regularly. So here he is at age 15 with his cousin, right before he started his own army. Here he is in Warsaw in his leathers, which allowed him to go wherever he wanted and pretend to be a military person, which the Germans seemed to respect. He went to Italy after the war, where he said he learned wrestling and didn't really do much. He was forced to go to high school, but he kept slipping out of that. And all this time he was with this corps, a Polish corps of the British Army. He then went to Glasgow, which he hated because it was cold and dark. And while there, he found out his mother, who was in the underground, was killed early in the Warsaw Uprising. She was a lieutenant and a nurse. And you can see he's third from the left with the glasses here. He then went to England, and he had a very low period of his life until he realized that he was meant to go to college and be a professional. So he went to college. He made plans to go to Trinity University in Ireland. Meanwhile, an Irish young woman named Moira was in England going to the Florence Nightingale School of Nursing. They fell in love. They actually lived together before they were married. And then they got married here. And you can see what a beautiful day it was. And then they moved to Ireland, where he attended Trinity College, and they had parties. Yarick in the upper right-hand photo is kissing a stuffed monkey. They did folk dancing. They had formals. And eventually he decided they needed to go to America because there was not much opportunity in Ireland, and he had faced a lot of discrimination in England. And he said that melting pot stuff in America, that's what made him realize it was for him. After a short stint in New York, they ended up in Indiana, where there was a new program at the University of Indiana in Slavic studies. And Yarick studied totalitarianism in Slavic countries. And in the photos on the left, Yarick and a pregnant Moira are holding his dissertation. And in the big photo, he's lying on the ground. They're having a celebration with friends. Through a fluke, he ended up being offered a job at the University of Kansas. And they arrived in Lawrence, Kansas in 1964 on an August night where it was 103 degrees. By then, they had their daughter Ellen and a bunch of homemade mead in the back seat. And soon they had their son Andrew. And here's the Piekalkewicz family growing up. Here's Yarick with Moira over the years, with one of his co-authors and teaching. And he is still writing and researching to this day. And here's Yarick on the left-hand side with his cousin, who he started the Underground Army with his former platoon leader. And here he is with his son, with Bob Dole. And here Yarick and Moira and their kids are over the years. We just have a few more slides and then we'll open it up. So. And here's Yarick's son Andrew had 4 children, and his daughter Ellen, who married a Polish man named Marek, had 2 children. And here they are. And the lower right-hand photo is Yarick with his sister, his brother, his sister-in-law. Moira's there. The older woman in the gray striped outfit is his aunt, who was also in the Underground Army and only died about 4 or 5 years ago. Yarick with his sister and brother received the highest Polish medal, given in honor of their uncle, Jan Piekalkewicz. And here's his Aunt Zula, who you saw in the gray striped shirt, 50 years after the Warsaw Uprising. And here's Yarick in his British Corps uniform. And here I am with the 2 men. When I was working on this, I felt like I was supposed to do it at that time, but I did not know why. Lou ended up getting prostate cancer, which came back, and he died January 24th, 2011. A year later, Moira died of a sudden heart issue on the exact same day, January 24th, 2012. And whenever I do this presentation, it's in honor of the two of them. So we're going to open it up. I know I'm a little late, but we also started a little late. So I will see if I can stop share. And Trey, if you're there, I'm not able to get out of this and stop share, and maybe you can do something.
How about that? All right.
Okay, here we are. There was some glitch there.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for that. That was incredible. We do have a couple questions here, and as we're going in, feel free to just type anything either in the Q&A or in the chat. We can make both work. One of the first questions was, how did all of these pre-war photos survive all of these events?
That's a really good question. With Yarick, there were enough people who survived, and the homes where they lived survived, that the photos were more intact. With Lou, it was more complex. He actually received a letter his mother wrote while in the Warsaw Ghetto, a bunch of photos 20, 30 years later, through a neighbor who left them with her kids, and then they were discovered during a move. Sometimes distant cousins who lived in other parts of the world who had photos. Sometimes those emerged, but the photos of Lou emerged very slowly and from surprising sources, sometimes 20, 30 years later.
I can only imagine the excitement of opening something like that up after all of that time.
Yeah, they were incredibly precious to him.
Another one, how did Lou and Yarick meet? Was it on that Fulbright that they did?
Yeah, they knew each other as, they were both Poles, and Yarick and Moira, as you can see, had a lot of parties, and they would invite Jane and Lou, and particularly if there was any visiting professor or students from Poland. And then Yarick encouraged Lou to apply for a Fulbright, which he did. And they all went, the four of them, Jane and Lou, Yarick and Moira, to Poland in 1975. And that's where they became best friends for life. And their families were very close, almost like one big family. And they understood one another's struggles quite a bit.
I can imagine. How did those struggles impact their careers moving forward? I saw Lou had an award from some of his presentations. Did they do things like that often?
Yeah, he did presentations quite a bit in the last 20, 30 years of his life. I once said to Lou, so your dissertation topic was, abusive fathers and, family, he had all kinds of things that related in my mind to Hitler and other extremes. Did this have anything to do with the Holocaust? And he just burst out laughing. Lou was, as a social worker and as a professor of social work, he was very focused on rights for others. And he was far more proud of his advocacy work for mental illness. One of the biggest achievements is that he led the fight to get a practice at the then Menninger Clinic, when it was in Topeka, called seclusion, made illegal. Seclusion was when teens, sometimes brought there because their parents didn't like who they were dating or for other reasons, were put in a room completely secluded for months until they broke and did what they were supposed to. And Lou actually faced a lawsuit because of that and a lot of other issues, but he was really proud of that work. And for Yarick, he taught totalitarianism, and he went back to Poland and Czechoslovakia and many other places.
We had a comment roll in from Debbie. Thank you so much for your hard work in writing the book and doing this presentation. The story and the photos brought to life a piece of the war that is not well known. It is beautifully done. Well, thank you, Debbie. Very
Thank
kind.
you so much, Debbie. And I encourage anyone who's interested in get a copy of the book, contact your library, or it's at University of Nebraska Press.
And I am right on that, Caryn. I'm gonna post this into the chat for everybody, make it as easy as possible. And I do recommend that everyone go pick up a copy as soon as you can. We have another question that came in here, and you touched upon a few of the reasons, but why did people dislike the Jews so much? I've never figured out the reason.
Well,
I know you talked about money lending and some of those professions that they only had the availability to do. Was there anything more than that?
I think that it also has to do with the other. If you think about in this country, the discrimination that Muslims have faced, and you think about other groups that aren't in the mainstream, and the more traditional Jews, they talked another language, they wore different clothing, they had different customs, they ate different foods, and that made them stand out as different. And I also think the economic pressure led to a lot of myths about Jews controlling the world and being astonishingly wealthy. I'm here to say, oh, if only, but no, seriously, that's obviously not true. Those are stereotypes. But I think to really understand that, we probably have to look at the deeper roots of humans, and why do we react against people of different religions, different colors, different backgrounds, different ethnicities. And it's a very, very complex thing.
Well, throughout this this project, when you were talking to the two gentlemen, did it ever unlock memories or things that they had either repressed or kind of forgotten about during their trials?
That's an interesting thing. Lou told me that several people said, I can hypnotize you so you can remember that lost week when you were locked in the factory. And he said, no, no, no. And I said, do you have any visceral reaction to things because of your experience? And he said, well, he's very anxious when the mail comes. And sometimes when a bell goes off, someone rings the doorbell or a siren goes off, he just has this reaction. And he became really aware of that. And it's funny, Lou taught post-traumatic stress disorder in classes, but he said he also didn't believe in it. Although he did believe there's damage that we carry. And Yarick, sitting right next to him, said, I believe in PTSD and I have it. And he suffered quite a bit, and Yarick has more physical injuries. I don't know that they remembered new things, in part because they were both so well versed in their own stories. Yarick had written an entire book that recently came out about his story and about the Polish underground, and Lou had done extensive research.
Do you happen to know the name, the title of the book off the top of your head? Not to put you on the spot.
Well, I know it has the word devil in it. I will hopefully dance with death. I'll put it in the chat box.
All right.
Dance with Death, view of saving Polish Jews during the Polish Holocaust. I did a presentation at Yarick's daughter's house in Tallahassee, and every Pole in northern Florida must have been there. It was just packed with people from Poland, and every single one had stories of parents or grandparents hiding Jews. And one of them said to me, well, this is the story of Poland. So that book is there. And Yarick was a few years ago given a great honor and award for his service from the Polish government in his home. And I got to see that along with his family.
Another question rolling in from Daniel here. How did you meet Lou and Yarick?
That's a good question. I'm friends with Rick Frydman, who's my age, and I would host Passover at my house, or we would have Rosh Hashanah services at our synagogue, and I would say, hey, bring your parents. And then bringing Lou and Jane also eventually meant bringing Moira and Mark. I didn't get a chance to talk about Moira, but she was larger than life. I'd call her up and she'd say, Caryn, Caryn, Caryn. She'd said everything 3 times. Wonderful Irish accent. I'd call her up and say, I have to reschedule with Yarick because I have a small headache. And she'd yell, Yarick, Caryn has a terrible migraine. And she was such a marvelous character. And many of us, all of us who knew her, love her and miss her. So it was more because I knew Lou's son, and then we would have parties and gatherings and we would invite them all. And I just really connected with them. And I was very intrigued with, you two have survived so much and you have made a completely different life in this new land. You know, you've lost almost everybody. You've lost your home. How did you do it? And how do you find joy and meaning? And that's what propelled me toward the book.
We are very fortunate that you were there to be able to be a part of kind of transmitting these stories. We're very, very fortunate for you. So it looks like we've got one last question, and it's kind of a heavy hitter. How do you respond to individuals that deny that all of these abhorrent events occurred? Do you have any experience dealing with people like that?
I have not that much, but I've also avoided them. I think when people are that deep down the rabbit hole of believing what's not true, it's very, very hard to convince them. And, you know, I've laid awake at night and thought if I could put Lou in front of them, or Sonia from Big Sonia in Kansas City, great movie you should all see, or other survivors, I would, but then it wouldn't really change them. If someone is so convinced they're not willing to change, I think the most important thing we can do is educate young people about the Holocaust. And there's very startling statistics about how few young people even know it happened.
Wow.
So you all coming to this presentation and listening and sharing what you've learned and continuing your learning, you're how we address them.
Well, perfect. Well, everyone here, definitely this will be finalized and posted on YouTube here after the presentation ends. So definitely feel free to pass it along with friends and family, and definitely spread this story around because it is just incredible. All right, well, it looks like we've kind of rolled through all of our questions. So thank you again so much, Dr. Mirriam-Goldberg. This has been wonderful. Your presentation was touching, informative, and inspiring. And again, I recommend everyone immediately go get a copy of Needle in the Bone. It will be worth your while. And I also hope everyone here can join us next month, September 9th at 6:30 p.m. to watch Dr. Alex Redcorn present on education and Indigenous peoples. He will walk us through some of the core issues found in our education systems and how it relates to representations of Indigenous peoples, answering the question, where is the contemporary American Indian? From all of us here at Museum After